Winter, 1927, Yukon. Written by TheOldStag. By week 3, we were sure that the supplies wouldn't get us through the winter. Not all of us, anyway. We'd passed a Yupik village about 50 miles back. It would be tough going, what with the temperatures being far less than 0. But a small team could take the dogs and be back to the cabin within a week with provisions, maybe sooner. It was a risk, but everyone would be dead by spring if we didn't roll the bones. Luck came up in my favor, and Colt, McGreedy, and I drew the long straws and got to stay, while Kohler, Andre, and Sizemore were to take the dogs and book it to the natives. We gave them our jackets and other valuables to trade and watched them disappear into the bleak forest. Unfortunately, that was also where my luck proceeded to wear out, because the next night, we got hit with a blizzard. It came on us out of nowhere, and for once, the shrapnel in my knee I got in Flanders didn't make a peep to warn me about it. The wind howled, and more than once I knew the thick logs of the cabin would collapse in on us, but they never did. We huddled around the fire and prayed because that's all we could do. The storm raged for 2 days and a night. The wind finally died down, and when I made to open the front door, I found it wedged shut by a mountain of snow that I knew threatened to engulf the entire cabin. I felt the sensation of a great weight pressing into us from all sides, and that thought caused my chest to tighten. We were snowed in, and the fear began to compound on itself when I realized that the others might not be able to find us. Our stores would hold the 3 of us for longer than they would 6, but it would not be enough to keep us fed through the winter. Not if we couldn't leave the house and forage, which we couldn't as the temperature was something far in the negatives, and we had given our jackets to our companions. We had a meeting, Colt, McCready, and I, about what we would do. We tried to tackle it with as brave a face as we could, but each of us knew that if the others couldn't find us, we would starve. If we tried to leave the cabin, we'd freeze to death in minutes. The only thing we could do was huddle up, keep the fire lit, and wait. By the end of the first week, we knew that the others weren't coming back. McCready seemed to take it the hardest, alternating between despair that they had died in the woods and bitterness that they had abandoned us. While we froze and starved, they were fat and happy with the native girls warming their beds. His attitude began to grate on Colt and I. At that point, I had gotten over my initial bout of claustrophobia, but being cooped up in that cabin, which had begun to stink something fierce, with little food or other diversion, was driving us to the breaking point. After 2 more weeks, the door would still not budge, and we were down to a handful of oats a day. We rarely spoke to one another, and we entered that twilight of sleep that neither blotted out the hunger pains nor passed the time. I snapped awake from one such stupor to hear what sounded like a pack of wolves howling and yipping just outside our cabin. It was that sound that caused McGreedy to finally lose it. The big man flew to his feet, screaming like an animal. He grabbed the fire poker and began to beat the door with it. Chips of wood broke off with each strike. Even huddled together next to the fire, the pervasive chill we constantly endured was enough to tell us that the 4 walls of the cabin were the only things keeping us alive, and that to remove the door was to doom us all. Colt and I launched ourselves across the room at McGreedy, and he barely seemed to notice our attempts to subdue him. Though we were all stout outdoorsmen, McGreedy was larger and broader than both of us, and he shook us off as though we were fleas. I knew that we couldn't subdue him in this state, and as I contemplated what to do, Colt grabbed a broken pickaxe and swung it hard at McCready's head. The spike punctured his skull just above his neck and re-emerged under his eye. The dead man staggered about like a drunkard, his lips flapping in his final slurred exhalation before suddenly collapsing like a marionette with its strings cut. I didn't begrudge Colt for what he did. I knew that there was no way to stop McCready, and that if we did not, we'd all freeze. Still, I couldn't help but keep my guard up around him. We stripped the dead man and divided up his clothes. Then we dragged him to the corner of the room. Even though he faced the wall, his presence weighed on me, as if he were asleep and I needed to keep quiet not to wake him. The presence weighed on me even more when the food finally ran out. And for once, I was thankful for the freezing cold. In that moment before each bite, there was only desire and hunger. Nothing else mattered. Shame would come later. As if, in a moment of carnal lust, you made love to your best friend's wife. But shame didn't last long in that cabin. The hunger always returned. There came a moment halfway through McGreedy, as Colt and I sat there staring at the fire, when I sensed that we both knew that only one of us would survive this ordeal. He'd scarcely let the pickaxe out of his hand since the fight, and he looked upon it with an intimacy that was almost romantic. I wondered what it would feel like to have it pierce your skull, what a killing blow would sound like in your own head. The day we finally stripped McGready to the bone, Colt made his move. He was telling me about growing up in Texas and how he worked on his father's cattle ranch. I'd heard the story many times, but there was little else to do to pass the time. He was in the middle of a story about a stud named Gunpowder when he suddenly leapt across the room with his beloved pickaxe. And there, I would have died and been eaten by a man that I had called a friend for 15 years. If not for the Luger that I carried on me every day since I found it on the body of a dead Hun in Europe, then it was just me. I had lost track of the days by that point, but I thought that winter was likely half done, and now I only had one mouth to feed. I entered a netherworld of darkness and horrors, a world where each lick of the flame painted monstrous shadows on the walls, and each moment brought terrors and howls born from my own mind. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that living in that charnel pit, eating my friends in the darkness, in the cold, had irreparably warped my mind, if not completely shattered it. I knew that even if I ever escaped this place, I would never be rid of it. The grinning skulls of my two friends would stare back at me each time that I closed my eyes. But somehow, I survived. One morning, I awoke from the stupor that served as sleep and saw a sliver of golden sunlight peeking through one of the cracks that McCready had made so long ago. I took Colt's pickaxe in my hand and began to pry the wood back, creating a larger sliver. The air outside was cold, yet not so cold as to kill exposed flesh. I dug frantically after that, and soon I had a hole in the door and the snow beyond for me to crawl through. The sun was blinding, and I felt like some wretched thing that had crawled from hell into the waking world. It took a few moments for my eyes to adjust, and when they did, I saw the forest I had watched my friends disappear into, now bathed in a magnificent yellow sunlight. Water dripped from icicles and heralded the coming of spring, and I felt an emotion burn in my heart that I had long thought dead: hope. I needed to head towards the Yupik village. Perhaps, I thought, my hope could extend to cover the other three that were still alive. I turned towards the house, and when I did, the tiny flame of hope went out and has never been reignited. I know now that was the moment that my mind shattered. The sight caused me to abandon the Yupik village, and indeed, the world of man altogether. For there, not 30 yards from the cabin, stood Kohler, Andre, and Sizemore, with their dogs and a massive cache of supplies. They were completely frozen and appeared to have been gnawed on by wolves. Their faces looked grotesquely hopeful, as if they were relieved that their salvation was so close at hand, and yet they couldn't make it. I crawled back into the cabin and settled onto my soiled rags. I closed my bloodshot eyes and I tried to blot out the world. But before I went into my restless sleep, something occurred to me that put my mind at enough ease to allow me to fall fully into my fitful sleep. I knew that whatever else happened, there would be plenty to eat.